Hey everyone, Yoyston here for a different sort of video. I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Usually things happening in the online Tolkien space come and go, and I really don't comment on most of them. This one has, however, caught my attention, and I've been asked to comment on it in recent live streams and podcasts, so I figured I would make a video about it. Let me know your thoughts on this in the comments below. Canon refers to a true state of fictional affairs within a work of literature as intended by the author. The question that we're going to be looking at today is, does Tolkien have canon? Just as the title states, let me go ahead and state my straight-up answer, and then address the counter-argument. Yes, Tolkien absolutely has a canon, an intended state of a story that plays out throughout the history of Middle-earth. Of course, Tolkien has canon, because that is what makes his story, from the Years of the Lamps or even the Ainu Lindle, all the way through what we know about the Fourth Age and the Dagor Daggerath and so forth, so generally consistent. In The Hobbit, Bilbo found the ring and then did not give it back to Gollum, taking it on his adventure and passing it on to Frodo in The Lord of the Rings. That objectively happened, because it is the catalyst for The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. That is an example of canon. But let me go ahead and actually address the counter-argument first before jumping into the meat of my argument on why there most certainly is canon. It is easy to look at Tolkien's literal thousands of notes about his story from all across his own lifetime, his thoughts and potential changes, editorial changes that he or Christopher did make, or the fact that Tolkien unfortunately passed away before he could publish everything. And you could see all of this as less than canon, less than the way Tolkien wanted. Therefore, you could see it as maybe there wasn't exactly a true canon. Even my example before, Tolkien revised that section with Bilbo and Gollum to reflect Bilbo taking the ring like he did, rather than winning it or anything else, even if Bilbo later twists the story to make him seem more like a hero than a villain for what he did. Of course, just like any author, Tolkien did revise and change things to reflect a new canon, releasing even new editions of previous books to reflect that canon. And even then, he played with other changes that he did not quite make. Along with all of this, most of Tolkien's stories are told through framed narratives, meaning it is through a character writing and narrating the story, such as in the Red Book of Westmarch, rather than some omniscient point of view, that we see all of the story unfold before us. Now, sometimes we're not sure about the reliability of the narrator, such as Bilbo speaking about his time with Gollum differently than how it may have actually happened. Yes, there is some of that, and so you could even argue that perhaps there isn't canon because it's spoken through a framed narrative. With all of that said, you could argue that since there just are, again, so many notes, and Tolkien didn't publish everything as he intended before he passed away, so on and so forth, how could there actually be Tolkien canon when there's so much ambiguity between all of these different things that we have now read, and knowing what Tolkien wanted to change and never got a chance to, as well as maybe something else I haven't mentioned? I would say all of this still doesn't defeat the fact that there is canon, because Tolkien did publish works. There is a canon because Tolkien was so meticulous about how his stories would be viewed. In his letters, he articulates so many points and his interpretations, and how other people perhaps should interpret his works. Now, this is not to say he was against people interpreting the stories and really feeling the stories in their own way, but this factors a bit into people making their own allegories and metaphors for the legendarium, which Tolkien didn't like. He did like when people viewed the stories that he was making as he wanted them to, but again, as an author, you can only do so much there. He also was not the largest fan of people becoming obsessed with his works, which, well, we are. But he thought it was a story. It was escapism, fantasy, that it should be seen as such. With that said, it seems that at every turn, what he wrote, what he published, he wanted to be canon, with his notes and unfinished works being something that he was so specific about and cared so deeply for that he wouldn't release all of his books until he saw them as being perfect or close to it. And Tolkien's perfectionism about his works is, perhaps, the greatest piece of evidence to point to concerning our question today. There was certainly canon, because otherwise Tolkien would not care about trying to perfect his story in his mind. He wouldn't care about trying to go back and correct other previously published works. And again, that adds a sense of ambiguity of what is canon, what isn't. But in Tolkien's mind and his project, what he always tried to do throughout his life was to really refine and publish a true sense of a canon story, that this is how it happened and this is how it should have happened. There was certainly canon, because otherwise Tolkien would not care about trying to perfect his story in his mind or in his notes, in later publications, anything. He would just let bygones be bygone. Oh, it was already published. No need to worry about it, right? But he continued to think about it. He continued to add notes and appendices and all of this stuff for years and years to really refine his story into something magical. And perhaps this is overly simplistic. I'm really not trying to strawman the opposing argument here, but it's a point that should be raised. If you all look at the screen and I just flip the map of Middle-earth upside down and I say that this is actually how the map of Middle-earth was through the story, that north was south and south was actually north, like, that's obviously not canon. That's not true to the works. And obviously, again, like, there is canon. There is truth to what Tolkien wrote according to what Tolkien wrote. You can't just change things, literally flip it on its head and say, oh, well, there's no canon, so either way, it's really fine. Therefore, if we say there is canon, there is something for adaptations to, adapt. I like to pick on Rings of Power here, of course, because it is the most popular worst offender of this. And really, this whole conversation online started because of an interview having to do with Rings of Power. You can't call something Lord of the Rings and inspired by or adaptation when you take a character like Sauron or Galadriel or Elrond, dump a majority of their actual lore from Tolkien, and give them things, themes, dialogue, whatever, that their canon characters would never do. Of course, something like Rings of Power is the worst offender for this, in my opinion, because it just gets so much easy stuff wrong. So many things that should be very clear, completely wrong. And then they use this argument of there not potentially being canon as a bit of a scapegoat and a bit of an excuse as to, well, let's just make the story we want to make. But no, you're calling it Lord of the Rings. There is a canon attached to that. And again, I would say this about other adaptations as well, but again, Rings of Power is the worst offender. Now, of course, when something is an adaptation, it doesn't need to be perfectly in line with the canon. I don't want anyone thinking that I'm some sort of purist, that it has to be exactly like that. But there is a line, when crossed, that something feels too different from the source material, that it lacks the quality which made the source material great to begin with. We can all think of some sort of example of this, where the thing that we loved is not what we're seeing on screen. It doesn't feel like that, right? And I think that's, honestly, that feeling is where a lot of this whole conversation stems from. Rings of Power, in many ways, doesn't feel like Lord of the Rings, especially when it goes against the canon. Even here on this channel, mostly what I do in my over 500 videos and podcasts and live streams is discuss Tolkien's canon, and I have for years. To say that there's not canon would be to say that I've just been talking about, random notes and musings and thoughts that don't really connect to anything because they're not more or less important than anything else Tolkien wrote, which is just absurd. But even when I do theories and give my opinions on things that may or may not be canon, I always try to say as much. I always say, here are my thoughts on this, here's my opinion, I might be mistaken, but here's this, right? I always try to caveat that. I don't want someone who isn't Tolkien, including, and honestly, especially myself, because I'm fortunate enough to be able to speak about Tolkien's works on this platform. I don't want anyone inserting things that corrupt Tolkien's vision and the quality of his legendarium. For me, many adaptations do capture the higher quality of the themes, the magic of Tolkien's works, like Peter Jackson's trilogy, or The Lord of the Rings Online, Battle for Middle-earth, and honestly quite a lot of other things too, such as tabletop games, or different books and commentaries talking about Middle-earth, and so forth. There are some things that take their own material too far and don't respect the canon as well, of course, as we discussed with Rings of Power, but I might also say about the story of Shadow of Mordor, Shadow of War, and some of the characters there. Again, great games, in my opinion, but when it comes to the lore and the adaptation part, I've never really been a super big fan of that. Again, there is, of course, canon. But I will say that as the story gets from more definite to less, from less obscure to more obscure, it may get a bit more complicated. For instance, we know that, no matter what, Aragorn II's father is Arathorn, or Elrond's father is Eärendil. Yet when we look at Gil-galad, mentioned in the Lord of the Rings appendices, Silmarillion, and many notes of Tolkien, this is up for debate. So it's hard to know what the actual canon is. The published Silmarillion says Fingon was Gil-galad's father. Other sources say Orodreth. That Fingon being the father was an editorial mistake by Christopher Tolkien. Things like this definitely do complicate this argument more. Do we go with the published Silmarillion or the answer Tolkien would have preferred? In my mind, there's a bit of a hierarchy here that we could follow, that I try to follow on my channel. The canonical answer is that which Tolkien wanted most lately in his life. And then after that comes what he published, and then after that are ideas that he mused on and maybe never got around to, assuming we know what it is he actually wanted and how it could fit in with the rest of his works. Things like the Dagor Daggerath, I will say, I'm not sure if it's canon. Again, it is mentioned in the Silmarillion, but Tolkien definitely changed his opinion about it later on, and we don't know if he would have replaced it with something else, any other sort of prophecy, or if simply Arda, as he did say in some notes, would have been marred by Melkor forever, and so no great battle would have happened wherein Melkor would have been permanently slain. So again, there is some ambiguity, and I will give the conversation that, but generally speaking, with most of the story of Middle-earth, there is canon, a main string of events that should be respected as Tolkien's desire for the telling of his story. And we especially see this in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, which have the least amount of post-publication changes compared to something like the Silmarillion or other notes from the History of Middle-earth saga, so on and so forth. So, to tie it all together, it is important for us to respect this from Tolkien. He made this world, the story, the characters, and he shared all of this with us. If you're going to adapt it, then adapt it. Sure, make changes when and where it's necessary. As a movie, how it's created and how it appeals to its audience, some of those things are not the same, certainly, as it is for a book. I absolutely understand that. And sometimes, in any adaptation, you can improve on certain parts from the book. You have that opportunity when you're adapting it. And maybe you've seen some of the criticisms that some people have for that moment in the book or whatever it is, and you can kind of work your way around that so you don't have to face the same criticism. Again, I understand all of these things, but it's another thing entirely to, again, take characters, take moments that we do know, and then flip them on their head and make them something else entirely. If you don't want to keep the core elements, themes, magic of it all intact, just make your own thing. Don't deface a story, lore, and a canon that we all love. And so, my friends, those are my thoughts on this debate. There is clearly an identifiable story, a canon that Tolkien wanted to tell us through his stories. Is it complex? Did he make revisions, some that he was not able to implement? Absolutely. But that doesn't mean his story is without structure or meaning, right and wrong ways to really read it and look at it. Things that adaptations should take into account if they're going to be made at all, in order to be respectful. Let me know your thoughts about all of this in the comments below. From all of this, we must remember that Tolkien's works are those, his works. We must respect the works of others for what they are. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed my take on this. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. Let me know your thoughts on Tolkien's canon in the comments below. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider getting some candles for our friends Mythologie Candles, or order some What It or United Cutlery, Lord of the Rings swords, statues, and other replicas from Castle Con, who does international shipping. Use the code WEST at checkout. Please check out our merch. Join our memberships and Patreon for access to our Discord server and our monthly podcast. Thanks to our Valar tier patrons and YouTube members. Ed Patterson, Comic Nut 64, Brian Hunley, Peter Sheppard, John Hume, Rhys Jenkins, Arthur Merlin, Theodore, Andrew Carlisle, and Zoomi. Thank you guys so much. You really keep the channel going. Please subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the Free Peoples today. And I'll see you all again next week with a video on Sauron's multiple deaths and his shape-shifting powers. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one.